Sup, Ryan? Yeah, I said it. I don't mind being the one with the unpopular take, okay? The moment I joined this tech game, I knew the odds were against me. But you're already watching, so just hear me out. So Apple came under fire some time ago for releasing the new M3 MacBook Pro with 8GB of RAM for $1,700. And I, for one, don't see a problem with that at all. Hey, I'm sorry, I can't do it. 8GB for $1,700 is crazy. I can't justify that. But, pricing aside, here's why I think 8GB of RAM for an Apple Silicon computer is not as basic as it sounds. Think of your computer as having a brain. The CPU is what provides the processing power to do all that you can do on your Mac. The more powerful and advanced your CPU processor is, the faster the computer can think and work. The GPU is sort of similar, except that it is particularly responsible for graphics. So think of all the creative and fun stuff you can do on your computer, like editing images and videos and playing games. It's the GPU's job to make the graphic-intensive work run as smoothly as possible. They communicate often. Now the RAM is kind of like the secretary to these two. RAM, or random access memory, is essentially responsible for temporarily holding the data for the CPU and GPU. So when it's time for the CPU or GPU to do something, the RAM is usually there ready to go with the necessary data needed to help out with that. Very quickly, I might add. Things like running an app, opening up a new tab, saving documents, or even when you last left your mouse on the screen, your RAM has to keep track of all of that to help your computer do its job properly. What? You thought that you could just browse the internet or run Photoshop for free? No. But this resource isn't limitless. How much RAM your computer has dictates how many things it can keep track of at once before your computer begins to slow down to compensate. I hope that made sense. And if it didn't, feel free to look more into it or read my comment section where someone will inevitably correct me. I love the internet. So now that we are aware of how essential RAM is, we can acknowledge that 8GB of RAM in reality isn't exactly a whole lot to deal with, especially when you have apps like Spotify or Discord open, which, while we're on the topic, are Chromium-based apps, by the way. So having them open is essentially having an entirely separate browser running on your computer, pretty much. A lot of apps and programs are only going to require more resources from your computer to run properly over time. So in a way, having a computer with so little RAM is essentially putting a due date on your device. In theory, you have to remember that you don't have access to all of those precious gigabytes of RAM. Some of that is already preserved for all of the stuff your computer needs to run smoothly in the background. With all of that being said, why do I have the audacity to think 8GB of RAM is enough on a modern Mac computer? Well, hear me out. Because if you think there's an asterisk somewhere, you would be right. Just like how you would be right if you subscribe to this channel. The subscribe button even lights up when I mention it. It's a no-brainer, really. So, in case you didn't know this already, the idea of RAM isn't entirely the whole story regarding the M series chips, because of this thing called unified memory. Yes, that jargon you see when you're window shopping for a MacBook, there's a reason why they use that term instead of just RAM. Because it's like RAM, but on a whole other level. Remember what I said earlier about the CPU, GPU, and RAM? Well, on an Apple Silicon computer, rather than all of these components occupying their own space and sending each other copies of their data to communicate like they typically would on a PC, they all instead have access to the same data on one single chip where your storage also rests. In other words, they're all roommates in a single studio apartment rather than next door neighbors. That's basically what unified memory is all about. Ah, great. A glowing black square. But what does that mean for me, though? Well, now that all of these components are on one chip, they can communicate with each other a lot faster, greatly improving the efficiency and performance of your Mac. Better communication equals faster computer. I even hear that they all eat at the dinner table at the same time. It's adorable. So 8GB of unified memory on an Apple Silicon Mac versus 8GB of RAM on an Intel Mac or PC are completely different just based on architecture alone. Now, there are times when you can run out of memory, but your Apple Silicon computer doesn't seem to slow down. Why is that? Because on top of your RAM being efficiently and dynamically used by macOS, it also has a failsafe by making your storage pick up some of the slack. Yes, when you run out of RAM, a section of your SSD essentially acts as temporary RAM to keep things running properly, called swap memory. The method isn't exactly perfect or anything, because temporary RAM from your SSD, which is very fast, still isn't as fast as authentic RAM on your Mac. And besides using your valuable storage for something other than storage, there's always a concern for the possible wear it'll put on your SSD in the long term. Those caveats aside, I do believe 8 gigabytes is enough for most people. Think about what the average person is doing on their MacBook. Browsing the web, watching videos, Zoom calls, research, occasional recording and light editing. The most basic Apple Silicon Macs are more than capable of handling all of that and more without breaking a sweat. I should know, because I own a Mac just like that. This is my M2 MacBook Pro with 8 gigabytes of RAM and 256 gigabytes of storage, which I used in making this very video. I've had it for just about a year, give or take a few months, and I can confidently say that this thing, besides a few rare occurrences, hasn't skipped a beat. And being that I do consider myself pretty resource conscious, I am a power user through and through, if that means anything. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't topping my Mac desktop, but it gets everything I need to get done just fine. A common argument I would hear is that MacBook Pros shouldn't be shipped with 8 gigabytes of RAM, considering that it's a MacBook for pros. But what exactly is a pro to you? As someone who has had this M2 MacBook Pro, I've had no problem working on images, writing scripts, or even video editing on it. If anything, the idea of what Pro is got revitalized with this generation of Apple Silicon Macs, considering how much of a disaster the Intel chips were. The barrier for entry is way smaller now, and just about anyone with a modern Mac can pull off some serious stuff, or go overkill on the casual stuff. I think a lot of people's idea of pro is pretty outdated at this point. The pro term comes with a lot of nuance, but I would argue that every modern Mac computer is capable of professional work. This improved performance and efficiency on the Mac is so good that Apple claims that 8 gigabytes of RAM on a Mac with an M series chip is equivalent to 16 gigabytes of RAM on a PC. Now, I can't help but see where they're coming from. RAM does have a different meaning depending on what device you're using, but I would argue that Apple has always been good at utilizing RAM with any of its OSs. I mean, look at their flagship phones. Think about how smooth and efficient they feel when you use them. Well, guess what? The iPhone 15 Pro Max uses 8 gigabytes of RAM. A lot of you would have never known unless I told you that just now. It sounds crazy on paper, but it's a different story when it's in your hands. I think the same sentiment applies here as well. Having said that, I do think 16 gigabytes of RAM should be the standard though, regardless of how greatly optimized Apple Silicon chips are. It's better for future-proofing, and it can't hurt having more wiggle room when doing multiple tasks. So if you're buying a new Mac, I would aim for 16 or more gigabytes of RAM if you can afford it, especially if you plan to go crazy on it. But when it comes to most things, any modern Mac, regardless of RAM, should be able to do just fine. But hey, that's just my rotten opinion. But what's yours? Leave it in the comments below. Shout out to my patrons Vasco and Icefire03. If you want your own custom icon or just want to support me in general, relevant links will be provided down below. Thanks for watching, and if you want to see more of me, you know what to do. Everyone's distracted by this whole RAM thing. What we should be paying attention to is the fact that we still don't have the classic glowing Apple icon on the back of MacBooks. They're distracting you. Wake up, sheeple.